Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 230, covering the week of August 31st through September 4th, 2020. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's A-B-B-E-V-I-L-L-E, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition. You'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday or Tuesday through Saturday, but you'll get it 5 days in the week. You can also support the Institute by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. Click on that support tab at the top of the page. We do exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like what we do, if you like the podcast, our conferences, all of our materials, our website, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. It is a great way to help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. None of this stuff is free, but we give it to you free of charge. So it's a great way to do these things. We also have some other projects coming up, so there's a lot going on with the Institute behind the scenes, and we're excited about these things, but again, they take money. So if you like it, please consider helping us out in that way. Also, you can click on that shop tab at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can get your Abbeville Institute apparel. It's high-quality embroidered material. So if you want a hat, a golf shirt, we're coming up on the fall and winter season now. Get your fleece with the Abbeville Institute logo on it. It's really great stuff, and so we do appreciate when you purchase that. Of course, it also advertises the Institute. We get a little bit of money off of that, too. You can also download our free mobile app. So if you want the Abbeville Institute on the go, just go to your app store, click on that, search for Abbeville Institute, click on that app, download it. You get all of our lectures. We have over 200 audio lectures. Of course, this podcast. Lots of great ways to keep in touch with the Institute and support what we're doing. Okay, so let's talk about the week that was at the Institute. And really this week comes down to a general theme that we've talked about over and over again on this podcast. Here we are, 230 episodes in. It's hard to believe, 230 in. And I've said this many times, but the Southern tradition is old. It's older than the United States, as we say on our statement of purpose on the website. It's older than the United States. It's 400 years old. And I think that we miss that sometimes with all the things that are going on nowadays. All the attacks on Lee or Southern monuments or symbols of a period of time, a 4-year period of Southern history. And what we really miss is that the enemy doesn't just want to take those down, because those are representative of something older and bigger than just a 4-year period of conflict where the South lost a war for independence. It's an attack on America. It's an attack on the Southern tradition, which is the backbone of the American tradition. If you look at all the things that were considered Southern over all the years, you think about the quintessential American in the 19th century. Who was it? Well, it was Daniel Boone or David Crockett. Two individuals that anyone in the United States would recognize as the ideal frontiersman. Of course, the indispensable man was George Washington, the man that was revered around the world for being who he was. And he wouldn't have been who he was without being from Virginia. Southerners played a key role in every major document that the United States is governed under, or at least led to independence. I mean, Southerners were playing a role in all these things. A lot of the things that we think of, for example, with 20th century legislation have been influenced by Southerners in one way or another. Some of these we like, some of these we don't like. Southerners have played a role on the left and the right. Southerners have played a role in the decentralist tradition. They played a role in the nationalist tradition. Look, John Marshall is a Southerner, or was a Southerner. I mean, he was an important part of that founding generation from the South. Now, he considered himself more of a nationalist, but John Marshall wouldn't have been John Marshall without being from Virginia either. It certainly influenced his thought moving forward. There's no doubt about that. So the South has an indelible stamp on America. And what's happening in the United States today is, unprecedented in terms of what we're seeing. Of course, a major news story this last week, which we didn't talk about on the website, but was the course at Washington and Lee University that actually was encouraging students to figure out how to rewrite history. This is Orwellian. We know this is their agenda. We know that what they want to do is rewrite history. They want to make it to where traditional heroes, things that have defined America, are called all kinds of names. They're not allowed to be said in polite company any longer because it makes people feel uncomfortable or less worthy or whatever the case may be. We know this is the agenda because if you take that and eradicate it, then other things, of course, will, in their hope, rise to the top that would be a less traditional vision of America. And by less traditional, of course, you take out the foundations of what made the United States. And, of course, you destroy the South. So the first piece that we ran this week, I think, is a nice example of what the South actually means to America. And it's entitled General Orders Number 9. It was written by Alphonse Louis Vin, who is just a great supporter of the Institute. We've got a couple of lectures of his now on the YouTube page that he gave at the 2019 summer school. And he's just a very nice man. Spent a lot of time in France and Paris. And I'll tell you, what this particular piece is a review of a film, a documentary entitled General Orders Number 9, independently produced in Georgia. The general feel of the film, its cinematography is just tremendous. It's beautiful. It's all about the imagery and the poetry. It combines, I think, three things that are important in the tradition. And the fourth thing, we actually had an article about this week as well from Travis Holt. But we'll just talk about this four-legged stool. One, of course, is tradition. It's reverence for ancestral customs, and that's what the Travis Holt piece is going to go into. But the others are, of course, Southern literature, poetry, the agrarian tradition, which is something that is so Southern. It's a respect for environment, it's a respect for place, it's a respect for green space. We think that's lefty environmentalism, but what is really missing in that lefty environmentalism is an understanding of nature. And Southerners were driving the naturalist movement for much of the 19th century. We forget that. Of course, there were naturalists in the North, but John James Audubon, people say, well, he's not Southern, he's from Europe. Well, he spent most of his life in the South. And so he's as Southern as anything else. He loved the South. But see, this is what Northerners, Yankees, will attempt to do. Yankees more than Northerners, just Yankees will attempt to do. They will attempt to co-opt things like Edgar Allan Poe or John James Audubon or George Washington. They become honorary Yankees because they're more important and they can't admit these people were Southern. Whereas Southerners will say, well, yeah, I mean, John Adams, he's an important guy. He is a Yankee. Important guy, though. Or Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman's a great Connecticutter. He's an individual that was certainly interested in the welfare of the Union, who believed in decentralization. He's from Connecticut, though, and he's not a Southerner, but some Southerners work with quite a bit because there was a common ground there. Roger Sherman wanted Connecticut protected from the South, and the South wanted to be protected from Connecticut. And so they saw that as Robert Lee Frost said, good fences make good neighbors. Put up the fences, and you maintain the integrity of your place. So General Orders Number 9, where the filmmaker takes us from, his documentary, is the point when the South surrendered at the end of the war. And he says that was a turning point in Georgia. It was a turning point in the environment. It was a turning point because what you had then was the introduction of the Northern political economy, the Northern worldview, and it was foisted on the South. There was no longer any opposition to it. So you start seeing the mass development of Georgia, and he's focusing most on Georgia. The mass development of Georgia, the rapid industrialization, at least ultimately, of the state, and how that changes. How Georgia changes because of one point. Now, Southerners love the convenience of industrialization. They love commercial culture. They love these things. They love McDonald's. They love this stuff. I mean, Southerners are just like anyone else. I remember talking to Don Livingston. He said, yeah, this is the hard part about it because, you know, if you were to go back in time and give Thomas Jefferson a car, he would have driven around in it. Everyone would have. I mean, this is what they would have done. They wouldn't have looked at it and say, well, that car is dangerous. I'm not going to get in it. Of course they drive around in it. They just would want to do it. If you landed an airplane at Mount Vernon, George Washington would want to fly in the thing. I mean, it's just what would happen. So how do you balance these things? And I think this is something in the South, this is what the agrarians were looking for, the fugitive agrarians in the 1930s. How do you balance modernization with tradition? That is the great question. It's why we're having a whole conference on this in October. How do you balance the two? How do you make them compatible? That's the hard part. And when you like the conveniences of the modern world, and certainly our standard of living, just look at the waistband of the average American, has gone way up. I mean, people are eating more now than ever before. We're eating cleaner food. When I say cleaner food, it's not full of bugs and worms and parasites and all kinds of things. We're eating cleaner food, not necessarily better food, but cleaner food. We have clean water. We have sanitation, sewers, and we have electricity, which gives the opportunity to do things like this. We have all these things that we like, but how do you balance that part of what makes life more comfortable with what may not make life better? And that is, of course, the downside of industrialization, which is the pollution, the destruction of the environment, the loss of green space, which people need. There's nothing more enjoyable, and in fact, Travis Holt talks about this, than sitting outside and listening to the wind blow through the leaves of the trees and enjoying the birds and enjoying the green space, or if you're on the coast, to hear the ocean and not having pollution at your doorstep. There's nothing more enjoyable than these things. So how do you balance the growth of the human population, the necessity of these industrial things that we want to make our lives more comfortable, air conditioning? How do you balance that with the respect for the environment? It's very hard to do. This was the idea behind the suburban movement. Well, you get people out of the city, you give them a little bit of land, they put a garden in. Now, of course, most people don't even want that. They just want to have as little space as they can, and they're going to sit inside most of the time in air conditioning because that's what makes us more comfortable and feel better. But does it necessarily make us feel better is the major question. And when you look at this General Orders number 9, you look at the stunning imagery of these things. You know, where are you more safe in this period of COVID than anywhere else? Well, outside, in the sunshine, enjoying the fresh air, the fresh, clean air. You're more safe there than anywhere else. And yet people, of course, tell us, well, you're going to have to wear a mask if you're out there. If you're outside, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But this film, this documentary, gets into it has these beautiful images of, cemeteries with development behind it, or beautiful woods with a big power plant sitting there, or whatever the case may be. What we think of as eyesores, cell phone towers. I remember years ago we had a poem on the website, cell phone towers. How cell phone towers have become these eyesores across the landscape of the United States, not just the South, but of course across the landscape. It's something different. And so that's why I really like this review of General Orders number 9. It's you can rent the documentary on Amazon or somewhere else. You can get it. And it's certainly, I think, worth your while to go watch it. It's a different kind of documentary. It's not something that you're going to sit down and say, wow, that was just so entertaining. It's a spiritual, almost metaphysical piece. And it has this melancholy to it of what's happened in our world and and this turning point when the South surrenders, which I think is heroic to even bring that up, how the South surrenders there. And then, of course, you had that piece by Travis Holt Requiem for a Quiet Man. And it's about his grandfather and all the things that his grandfather taught him to do. This reminds me a lot of Robert Rourke, The Old Man and the Boy, which is just a great collection of essays, little short stories about growing up with a grandfather that taught him how to do things. Now, in my own life, I think if you had a grandfather, worth his salt, everyone remembers this as a boy. And I remember my grandfather lived in the Rocky Mountains, and I remember spending years, out there every summer to go out and just go hiking in the Rockies with him. And he was in his 80s and would still go up there and go hiking in the Rockies. He grew up in a different kind of life. And it was that tradition passed on down. And that's why I really gained a respect for the natural world as you're standing in these beautiful places. And the West was certainly influenced by the South. There's no doubt about it. The people there and this rugged individualism, you wouldn't have had that without the Southern stamp on American society. And this piece has that. It certainly has this respect for ancestral customs, respect for the environment, respect for the place. You're from a place. This is often said, Southerners ask you where you're from. Yankees will ask you what you do. But where are you from? Because that says more about you than what you do. What you do is an occupation. What you do is to earn a living. But where you're from, well, that means something. That means something because that means, what kind of culture are you going to have? What kind of people were you around? How did you grow up? Who influenced you? And these are things that I think sometimes we forget about in modern society because, again, what you do becomes what you're worth. And there's more to the human condition than worth or income. And I think that's what, the Southern tradition tries to hang on to in so many ways, that there's more to the human condition than simply what you do and how much you make. It's what you contribute to society, and not just that, your culture, how you commune with society as well. And so I love these two pieces. If you get a chance, you haven't read them yet, General Orders Number 9 and Requiem for a Quiet Man. It was the first two pieces of the week. But of course, and Southern history is more than just the war, as I said. The piece on Thursday, the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, gets into this tradition and masculinity and what men would do. You had corruption in Athens, Tennessee following World War II. You had political corruption. And it was decided by the men of Athens, Tennessee, they weren't going to stand for it anymore, and they went out and cleaned up the town. You see this in southern towns and other places. You saw it in Phoenix City, for example, Phoenix City, Alabama, which had tremendous corruption after, not just after the war, but before World War II. Tremendous corruption. And the people there decided to clean it up, and it cost one of the men who was leading the charge his life, Albert Patterson. You find this in the South as people try to wrestle with modernity. Again, it's wrestling with modernity. Phoenix City wouldn't have been so corrupt if it wasn't for the big military base that was stuck right across the river in Columbus, Georgia. You had people coming from all over the United States, and as soldiers move into an area, it brings with it crime because you have a lot of young men with nothing else to do. So, of course, Phoenix City had some of the vices that soldiers are well known for wanting to partake in, right on the doorstep of Columbus, Georgia. So modernity itself brought some of that to Phoenix City. Also Columbus. It was also in Columbus, Georgia. It wasn't just in Phoenix City. But that story about the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, Neil Kumar, it's a great story about how people decided they weren't just going to sit around and let things happen. They were going to make things happen for themselves, and they were going to improve their city and take it back from corruption. Again, another trait of the South and the Southern tradition, trying to get corruption out. It's something that Southerners were well known for. But of course, the problem with all of this is that we're not just fighting a battle against the left. It's often talked about that. It's the left that's the problem. And you've got the Marxists, you've got the cancel culture SJWs. You have these people. What makes it worse is the neoconservative right, because these people should be. They're right. They're on the right side. We're gonna push back against the cancel culture. We're gonna do these things. But what they don't realize is that by criticizing Lee or criticizing the South, they're undermining their own position. When they criticize the Southern tradition, when they're critical of the South, they undermine their own position, because what they're doing is undermining American conservatism. The South was always the anchor to American conservatism. And it's not just about, people say, well, it's all about race and slavery. It's not that. It's bigger than that. Because what the South offered was a traditional opposition to European innovation, which the North definitely jumped on board with. In the 1860s, 1850s, 1840s, and they ran with it in many different ways. So the piece on Friday, Brain Dead Neocons, gets into this a little bit. And I'm going to wrap it up with a piece on Wednesday with Lee, because this comes full circle to this. So the neoconservatives often are critical of the South because they say that Lee embodies treason, slavery, all these things. This is what Lee is about. The South is about these things. The North was in this righteous crusade to go rid the United States of all these evil things, treason and slavery. And so if you have these monuments up, well, you're just glorifying treason and slavery. And not just that, they're Democrats. You see, the problem with the neoconservatives is that they exist in this world of Republican and Democrat. And that's not the correct dichotomy anymore. Really never has been. The Republican Party has been the same party since the 1860s, 1850s when it was formed. It's the same party. It hasn't changed. It's just that Southerners lost their party. They lost any party that would try to appeal to the traditional South. And Republicans rhetorically will do it at times, but they really don't believe it. They don't believe it at all, because if you look at what they say about Lincoln or the things that they celebrate the defeat of the South. They might give lip service at times. Well, we need to keep Confederate monuments up. I'll never forget, there's a book by a guy named Stepman, and it's The War on History, I think the title is. And he gives a defense of Lee, but it's half-hearted and lukewarm. It's, well, yeah, the left is right about these things about Lee, but we should leave it up anyways. That's not a real defense, and you see Stepman is a Straussian Claremont Institute neocon. In many ways, that's what he is. He's right about, of course, being upset about monuments coming down. It is a war on history. But when you give a lukewarm defense of something, it's really not much of a defense. You might as well just not say anything, because you're giving the other side the ammunition they need. If you say, well, if you agree with us on all these things, well, why do you keep it up? Well, because we just should. That's not a good argument. That's not a good argument at all. It's a bad argument. It's an argument that leads to your defeat. But this is generally the tepid response that we get from neoconservatives, which is why they're calling them brain dead. I think is actually a compliment. Spineless is more like it, because they're afraid to be called names. If you actually said, Robert E. Lee was a great American, he should have a statue because he's Robert E. Lee. That's the response that needs to be there. Not, Lee, yeah, he did some things, and, whether this was treason, we can debate that. Maybe it was, but, he just needs to be there because he's there, and we're going to rewrite history if we take this down. No, it's because Robert E. Lee should be on a statue because Robert E. Lee was a great American. That's what he was. And generations of Americans recognize that. Even people like Booker T. Washington recognize this. So we should have a statue to Lee because Robert E. Lee is Robert E. Lee. We should have Washington and Lee University because Lee was one of the most important Americans in the history, or one of the most important Virginians in the history of the state. I mean, you've got Washington and Lee. The only other Virginians you could say that maybe have better name recognition would be Jefferson and Madison. That's it. Those four. Lee is in that group of four. And so he should be there. Now, of course, the left will try to take Lee's words and say, well, but he really didn't agree with monuments. This is what the piece on Wednesday was about. What Lee really said about monuments in 1869, of course, he's dead the next year. He's dead. And what he really said about monuments. He says, Lee, this is by Ernest Blevins, and he says, Lee wrote on 4 August 1869 his reply to David McConaughey's invitation to participate in the reunion of Gettysburg veterans who identified specific historic battlefield sites and offered personal accounts of the engagement. Many letters in the Gettysburg College Get Digital collection of these letters are responses to this man's invitation. I declined to attend for a variety of reasons, some even naming others to consider inviting for the desired information. Lee was not alone in his absence from the event. The entirety of Lee's letter is, quote, absence from Lexington has prevented my receiving until today your letter of the 26th, enclosing an invitation from the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association to attend a meeting of the officers engaged in the battle at Gettysburg for the purpose of marking upon the ground by enduring memorials of granite the positions and movements of the armies on the field. My engagements will not permit me to be present. I believe I could not add anything material to the information existing on the subject. I think it wiser, moreover, not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the examples of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife, to commit to oblivion the feelings engendered. So this is often said that Lee did not support monuments. He did not support Confederate monuments. But you look at what Lee said about this and the entirety of it. He's talking about the battlefield itself. He's not certain we should even preserve the battlefield. And he didn't really think, if you look at what he's being asked to do, to attend a meeting of the officers engaged in that battle at Gettysburg for the purpose of marking upon the ground by enduring memorials of granite the positions and movements of the armies on the field. So what he's saying here is that I'm not certain we should have granite memorials to this battle on the portions of the battlefield itself, because this could leave open the scars of war. He wasn't certain it should be that way. But he doesn't say he's against monuments necessarily. This is a particular place, and a particular type of monument on the field of battle. Now, his son, of course, Lee dies the next year. At this point, as Blevins points out, at this point in history, in 1869, there were 423 Union monuments had already been erected in the United States, and only 52 Confederate monuments. I'm sorry. Excuse me. There were 52 Union monuments. Let me get this right. 52 Union monuments in 1869. Only 3 Confederate monuments in 1869 across the entire United States, North and South. So in that year, there were 17 Union monuments to every 1 Confederate monument. It wasn't until you get to the turn of the 20th century, till 1914, that you actually have the same number of Union and Confederate monuments. So the Union was building monuments at a rapid pace when the war was over. The South had no money, or they would have been doing the exact same thing. They would have been building monuments to remember the dead and remember the men who supported independence, just like the Union was building monuments to remember their dead and who fought for the Union. So this is the problem. Lee didn't say he was against monuments. And of course, Blevins brings up William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, who began speaking at first in 1869. He said, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have granite proofs of its civil war someplace. But on the other hand, just a couple of years later, he starts speaking at dedication ceremonies. So I think he realized that the North was going to put them up, so the South should put them up too, because if you don't, well, then you have a one-sided vision, a one-sided version of what actually happened here. You're saying that the South was wrong the entire time, and the South was defending itself, saying, no, it wasn't wrong. It was not wrong in pursuing independence. It was not wrong in pushing for what they believed was a constitutional right of withdrawal. Those things weren't wrong because they understood what would happen if they were called wrong. It would be treason. And all these men would be traitors then to the United States if that was wrong. But we know it wasn't. We know it wasn't. So I like this piece because it gets into this particular argument. Lee was against monuments. He wasn't. We don't know what he would have been against later on. We know that here at this point, it's saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have a battlefield monument. That might not be a good idea. But maybe later on we could have something. His son certainly believed that. We don't know what Lee would have said himself. So there isn't really any conclusive evidence as to what Lee would have thought about any monuments outside. He said this, could he saying about Union monuments? He would have been critical of Union monuments too. So maybe we shouldn't have any monuments. So I like this piece, and again, it brings it back to this General Orders number 9, how the world turns in 1865, how America turns at that point, and what the overall consequence of that would be for the United States moving forward in many different ways. And we're still feeling those consequences today. All right. Hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.